And colleagues, parliamentary colleagues, thank you for having me here today. It's a great pleasure to be here to speak to my bill, C-290, an act that would better protect whistleblowers within the public service. This is a very important moment for me, and it's important for many whistleblowers. This is actually an historic time. For more than 20 years, there has been very few moments and opportunities to improve disclosure protection within the public service. And I would also say this is a non-partisan time. Sound management of finances and of government is profoundly a non-partisan issue. Now, there is an act that exists now, the Public Service Disclosure Protection Act. Unfortunately, though, it has its shortcomings. And because of this, unfortunately, trust has been broken for potential whistleblowers, trust between these potential whistleblowers and the government. Now, this has been looked at by the Government Accountability Project, and actually it was ranked as one of the weakest in the world. Canada actually has beaten by Lebanon, Afghanistan, Tunisia, Kenya, Zambia, Kosovo, Namibia. Canada is behind these countries. Now, we're a G7 country, a country that is a member of the OECD, and we're a democracy that is supposed to have solid institutions, so this is a problem. The purpose of this act is to strengthen anonymity for whistleblowers, and we want to add more categories of public servants who can disclose wrongdoing, protect as well the identity of witnesses who are involved in investigations. This bill also would increase the obligation of support for whistleblowers, and it would provide more time to file a complaint, because currently that time is much too short, because disclosing wrongdoing will take sometimes more than 60 days to happen. This is also a bill that will simplify appeal processes when there are reprisals, for example, reprisals against those who have decided to blow the whistle. The bill also, in cases of mismanagement, will allow for an appeal to the Auditor General. Now, remember that this act arose out of the aftermath of the sponsorship scandal, and people did turn to the Auditor General at the time. The purpose of this bill is to restore trust between the public service and the government. Whistleblowers are people who want to better protect the public. These are people who are very brave. When you decide to disclose wrongdoing, the consequences can be enormous. Over the course of this study, you will be meeting witnesses whose lives were ruined through their decision to disclose wrongdoing. And this is because of the process, and a process that has too many shortcomings. These people were punished for having wanted to serve Canadians, Quebecers, taxpayers, democracy, our institutions. These are individuals who, in some cases, were monitored. You will be meeting individuals who, in deciding to testify before this committee, are still anxious worried about suffering reprisals for testifying. And these are the things that we have to look at. This is a democracy issue. So in protecting whistleblowers, we're protecting sound management and a sound public service. And we're also actually protecting the government. You know, scandals are not a style of management. You can't just correct things after there has been a scandal. There have to be mechanisms in place that allow those people, when they see wrongdoings, be able to trust in the government, and the government be able to receive these complaints. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guerin. Colleagues, before we start our first round, there will be bells at 5:30. We'll do the customary ask in advance for unanimous consent to continue maybe to about 5 minutes to 6. Hopefully we'll be able to get through Mr. Guerin as well as the opening statements from our witnesses from the second hour before we suspend. We're good with that? Thank you very much. I appreciate that, colleagues. Mrs. Cusi, you're opening for 6 minutes, please.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to Mr. Garron for coming today. And thank you for the work that you have been doing on this bill. And thank you for doing what the government decided not to do. Why do you think the government decided to not implement the 2017 report recommendations? Well, you know, it's difficult for me to guess at motives of a government, and that's not the purpose of my testimony today. One thing that one must recall is that the Government Operations Committee produced a report many years ago, and it was a consensus report, and it arose out of many, many high-quality briefs. And what you see in my bill is largely inspired by that report. You know, we're in the opposition. We don't have the same means to do things. We can't necessarily suggest that lawyer fees, be covered. So, if you want to go up to the Supreme Court, people can go bankrupt. They incur costs of up to $1 million. So there are many steps in this bill that were already the subject of consent and unanimity within the committee. Now, why am I bringing this bill forward? I was shocked shortly after my election in 2021 by the fact that I was getting phone calls and emails from whistleblowers. These whistleblowers had witnessed wrongdoing. I'll say alleged wrongdoing because I'm not an investigator. And so my question was, well, why aren't you disclosing this? Why aren't you using the procedures that are in place? And the response was often, listen, we know people have taken risks. It ended their careers. It ruined their lives. It had mental health impact and other impacts. So there are people who are witnessing wrongdoing, but they're afraid. They're afraid of losing their jobs, their homes. And so I opened up the act. I looked at it. And we looked into this. We saw the OGO report. We also saw the cases of people who had disclosed wrongdoing. And when you read these reports, you can see all the gaps that there are. And, when you travel along a road and all you see is potholes along the way, well, it's impossible to get to the end of that road without falling in that hole yourself. And that's when I said to myself, it's in the public interest for me to bring in a bill. Well, that was going to be my next question. I wanted to know if you had any personal experience or a personal story to tell. Here's my next question. When you looked at this 2017 report, how did you decide what you would add to your bill? Why did you choose specific parts? What was your criteria when you looked at all the recommendations? Why did you choose what you did to put in the bill? How did you decide on picking certain parts of that report? Well, there are it's a three-part answer. You're limited when you're in the opposition. And obviously that was clearly part of the equation. Second, I have a profound desire to see this bill adopted, and I think we can do it, and I want it to be the subject of a consensus. The bill, as it is written, I feel, and you know, we're open to amendments and to a conversation, but I think the parts of the Ogo report that we put in there have a high potential of being the subject of a consensus. Now, yes, this comes with a cost. You know, it means that all the work might not have been done, but we have been waiting for years for changes that could be made simply and efficiently. So I would say any step forward is welcome. And I think in this case, we're taking several steps forward. So that is why we brought it forward in the form that it is. So what do you think the next stages would be? Also, what is your opinion of the task force that was set up by the government? Do you know, the whistleblowing file is not out there enough in the public. It's not something that people are talking about enough. And when the bill was tabled, the president of the Treasury Board actually sped things up to do more consultations. So I would say there are two messages here. On the one hand, I'm very happy that we're talking about these brave men and women who have decided to blow the whistle and want to improve public management. So that was the first effect of this bill already, and that's a success. Now, if the government wants to consult, it can. It can call on experts, and later on it can continue to improve the bill if it wants to. So that, for example, the royal recommendation is not necessarily required, for example. But I don't think that these paths are mutually exclusive. We can adopt steps that are the subject of consensus, and we can continue to consult. And I think in doing this, the president of the Treasury Board is acknowledging that this process be ongoing and that this work actually is never really done. Thank you very much, Chair.
Welcome back to Ogo. You have 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for welcoming us all, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Garon, for his initiative with this bill, C-290. As our colleague just said, I think this is a golden opportunity to find consensus, and I do hope that we can find a way to improve the Act in a way that will be consensual amongst all political parties. Mr. Garon, I do have a few questions to ask you about some parts of the bill. In this bill, several of the amendments to the Act attempt to avoid overlap, for example, like Section 19.14. So it prevents people to start procedures under another act or, say, under a collective agreement if they, for example, file a complaint of reprisals. You would like that to be repealed, actually, any of those sections to be repealed in the Act. So what do you think about that? The purpose of the bill is to provide more recourse to whistleblowers. So when you look at it, that's exactly what it does. This is a bill that is complex, yes. It protects whistleblowers. And yes, it may interfere with many areas of the public service because its scope is broad. What I think is that we will need to bring amendments forward, and I think everyone is aware that there is going to be work to do. Furthermore, I think that the Treasury Board has a role to play. The government has a role to play. The entire governmental machine is a complex one with many interacting parts and moving parts. And so it's absolutely necessary to listen to public servants on this, and we are open to hearing all. That being said, there are some mechanisms already under collective agreement, under other negotiated agreements, but that should not be a pretext to not legislate in this area. You know, often unions had to come and fill in for the gaps of the current regime. But there are minimal standards that need to be established. Well, in your bill, can you speak to, say, reasonable grounds and good faith? Why are those taken out? Mr. Roche, thank you. And thank you for the question. There are references to good faith, yes. And those speak to the intention of the whistleblower. Sometimes a whistleblower may have been witnessing things over the years that they did not like. And it is possible that when they end up disclosing, well, another person may feel that their intentions are wrong about their colleagues. And that should not be a consideration. The consideration should be how well-founded the complaint it is itself. It shouldn't. Someone shouldn't be disregarded simply because you see it as being done in bad faith. So we shouldn't be in a position where we're judging the intention of someone when it comes to considering a complaint. If someone is speaking the truth, well, then the original intention shouldn't influence whether that complaint can be filed or not. Yes, but if you repeal some of these terms, could you not end up with some vexatious, for example, complaints? Given the current state of affairs, I think actually the current process may prevent people from going forward. The purpose of the bill is to improve the management of public funds, improve sound administration. And if the complaint is well-founded, then there is an obligation for the government that wants to improve its procedures to go ahead with these complaints. Now, the section that you are referring to could actually prevent steps being taken to improve sound management in the public service, simply because judgment has been passed on the intention of the wrongdoer. And, you know, the cost of keeping a section like that, the cost would be higher than the benefit of repealing it. I'm wondering if there's any room for compromise in there. I'm wondering if we might be able to come up with something in between or more reasonable. Well, there's always a way to bring forward amendments and to find ways of rewording a bill, as long as it doesn't overshadow the actual intent of the bill. Thank you.
Yes, Mrs. Vignola.
Ms. Vignola. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. Garon, for being here today. And thank you especially for having tabled this bill. During the last Parliament, we had begun, well, I would say actually we had expressed our intention to consider the bill, and then what happened in 2021. And so now we are starting the study, and it's truly appreciated, especially on the part of public servants. You already stated why you introduced this bill, but just for educational purposes, could you perhaps compare the act with the bill that you've brought in? As I said earlier, the purpose of the current bill is to protect anonymity on the part of the whistleblowers. And there's also the issue of witnesses and investigations. You know, I'm just going to give you a few examples. When you decide to disclose wrongdoing, you're really making a commitment that affects your career. And oftentimes you're the only one who has witnessed wrongdoing. So you need someone to corroborate what you've seen, to support that. But that person may not be at the same stage you are. So even if you protect the anonymity of the whistleblower, what about the people who have witnessed this? And if you don't protect their anonymity, well, then you reduce the power of the person who wants to come forward. Now, there's also the issue of the timeline. Under the current act, when you witness wrongdoing, you have 60 days. Now, I'm telling you this again because you will hear witnesses who have gone through this process and paid a high price for it. 60 days to start thinking about whether or not this is in the interest, the public interest, whether or not it's in the country's interest, whether or not it's in the government's interest, whether or not you want to lose your job, lose your home, be harassed, etc. Because, you know, there are reprisals. 60 days to decide something like that, that's a pretty short timeline. You know, you have to think about your mortgage. You know, even when you take out a mortgage, you take more time than that. So we want that process to be extended to a year. And I would even say that even 1 year is short. Now, there's also this ability to turn to the Auditor General. Let's say we're talking about witnessing any sort of criminal wrongdoing. Well, you can turn to the RCMP, yes. However, when you're looking at very serious shortcomings in management, the Auditor General has quite a huge field of jurisdiction and also of skills. So this is also one of the changes we want to bring in. We want to bring in their ability to support public services. When public servants are also the subject of reprisals, what we would like to add is the ability to be heard and the ability to be heard about these reprisals before these people have to go and empty their pockets and go to the federal court. These are major changes. And it will make, in the end, the procedure much less costly for these whistleblowers and much less costly, therefore, for the government that will be in a position to have to manage this entire legal procedure, whether it has to do with appeals or anything else. So these are major changes in this bill, Bill C-290. It takes a lot of courage to come forward, as you said. I was wondering if, to your knowledge, are there any whistleblowers who have had to require support and wanted to be able to disclose wrongdoing and weren't able to? I can't necessarily give you specific examples at this point in time. Well, can you tell me then what have you learned from whistleblowers on their experiences? I would have thought that in a developed country, one would consider the experience of these people as a source of expertise, because these are things that can help us improve our processes. You know, I come from an academic background. We're always learning. I've spoken to whistleblowers. In many cases, they suffered reprisals, even vengeance, and physical violence, mental violence. Think about what that does to an individual and the loss of trust in their employer. These people are loyal to their employer. They want the government to work properly. They want the government to be able to provide services to Canadians. And these individuals may just end up being victims themselves of collateral damage, and their families end up being victims. And I would think one would only welcome their experience and what they have to say. But there are many cases, and the problem with the current regime is that there's now been broken trust. So we don't even have the statistics of the people who aren't coming forward. But I would have thought we would have welcomed them as a source of knowledge and expertise. Thank you, Mr.
For 6 minutes, please.
Merci. It's good to see you, Mr. Grant. And before I get started, I really want to commend you. I know you had a very high order of precedence for PMBs, and you had many things that you could have advanced, and you put workers first. And I really want to thank you for that. That's really important. And I want to thank my colleagues at this committee as well, because they also want to advance, the discussion around your bill so that we can fix it. So we know workers are going through a difficult time. The inflation it's way surpassing their wages right now. People are on the picket line right now. They're struggling to make ends meet. Further exasperating that is the mental health that they face, when it comes to the challenges around the current whistleblowing system. So we're really happy about this bill, around the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act and improving it. They're direly needed, and as you stated, we fall behind our peers in other countries in protecting public servants, which disclose wrongdoing. So it's important if we don't protect public servants who blow the whistle, wrongdoing, it stays hidden, and we all suffer for it. So again, I want to thank you for moving forward. Today is an opportunity for us to help strengthen the bill. We've had some time to consult with some whistleblowers and some stakeholder organizations that advocate for them, and they've raised some concerns about the bill. So obviously want to bring them forward to help improve it. If we're to truly have a system that protects public servants who make disclosures. So some of them, and this is again about improving the bill. One that we heard is around the reverse onus. So that would mean that when a whistleblower goes before the tribunal to prove employer reprisal, the burden of proof would switch to the employer, who would need to show that they had good reasons to take action against the employee, reasons that aren't related to, say, the whistleblowing. So this is the foundation of any decent whistleblowing protection act. And so maybe in your discussions with stakeholders and public servants, have you heard about this, that this was a priority? And maybe, maybe why did you choose not to include it in the bill for any reason, or has it posed any concern?
First of all, yes, we did discuss this. It was raised by many whistleblowers, and some of them are actually here today. And this is one of the things that should be discussed. There has to be a rebalancing of this burden of proof. And if this is the will of the committee, that's something we could work on. We're very open to this. Now, under the current state of affairs and in the bill itself, there's something that does make the process easier. Today, if you're a whistleblower, well, let's take reprisals for an example. You have to go to the commissioner, and if there's acknowledgement that you've been the victim of reprisals, then the next level provides you with compensation. But if at the first step there's been no acknowledgement that you're a victim of reprisals, you have no recourse but to go before the federal court, and that's a very costly process. So what we would like to see is that at that second level, at the tribunal, you would receive compensation as in the current act, but also to have an opportunity to review the verdict and provide a second opportunity to be able to speak to the reprisals again. And that gives an extra opportunity to the whistleblower to have their rights respected. This would be less costly, it would be faster, and less damaging to their career, and it would actually make the whole process easier.
I think just in terms of back to in terms of the integrity commissioner and the investigations, a concern around that's missing in the bill is, and I'll ask you about it today, is the need for proper independent investigation of the wrongdoing that gets reported. Experts and advocates in the field, they've told me that we can't be confident in the investigations happening under the current act because the public sector integrity commissioner has always been from, it's been a government public servant. And maybe do you believe that the government, a public servant who has had their career and their connections relying upon staying in the government's good graces is the best person to serve as the integrity commissioner? And maybe do you think that a truly independent expert would be better able to carry out truly independent investigations of wrongdoing?
Well, during our conversations with whistleblowers and with legal experts, international legal experts who work with various regimes, oftentimes commissioners who are appointed come from a government and end up going, yes, back to it. That has been identified as a problem. The bill doesn't refer to this, but when commissioners are being appointed, obviously there has to be some awareness of this on the part of the government and sensitivity to this. Now, there is recourse to the Auditor General as well. So when there is sort of alleged mismanagement, you can have recourse to the Auditor General. And they are absolutely independent. We fully trust them.
About the bill that we heard from stakeholders and public servants that they've raised again and again is the need for injunctive release. This would mean proactive protection of whistleblowers from day one when they first report the wrongdoing. When whistleblowers report wrongdoing, do you believe that it's important for them to be able to immediately obtain an injunction to prevent employer reprisal? And do you see it as a critical aspect of protecting them?
I'm afraid that's our 6 minutes, but maybe you can answer in Mr. Johns' next round. Mr. Barrett, for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thanks very much, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'm just not sure how much time we have with bells, etc. So I just have one thing to do before I proceed with my questions, and I'd just like to give notice of a motion that I'm not moving. I'll provide it in writing in both official languages to the clerk, but that motion is that the committee, A, invite the deputy heads from the following entities in relation to the redactions and improper translation of documents requested by the committee on January 18, 2023, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, Business Development Bank of Canada, Canada Border Service Agency, Canada Development Investment Corporation, Canada Post, Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, Department of Finance Canada, Employment and Social Development Canada, Export Development Canada, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, National Defence, Natural Resources Canada, Office of the Veterans Ombudsman, Veterans Affairs Canada, the Privy Council Office, Public Sector Pension Investment Board, and Trans Mountain Corporation. B, invite the Office of the Law Clerk to brief the committee in public on the extent of the committee's powers to call for documents. C, instruct the chair to send a letter to each of the entities listed in Section A of this motion to inform them that the committee is currently considering referring this issue to the House of Commons as a possible breach of parliamentary privilege. Thanks very much for your patience. Can you share examples of reprisals that whistleblowers have faced?
J'ai été en contact avec.
Well, I've been in touch with many whistleblowers. Some are happy to disclose their identity, and others, some have accepted to testify, others not. So there are several situations. One person, for example, saw all their work removed. They had nothing to do all week, and then at 2:30 in the afternoon on a Friday, all the work was piled onto their desk. We've even heard cases of where people were followed home. There are cases of psychological harassment. And, you know, it's important to point out that when you start ostracizing a whistleblower in the workplace, that person becomes toxic to their colleagues. So let's just say that the higher-ups start ostracizing you and start taking reprisal steps. Well, within a workplace, there's just a natural tendency to remove yourself from that person, to remove that person from the teams, to distance yourself. So there are direct and indirect consequences on their quality of life.
Have there been individuals who have been mistaken for a public servant who made a protected disclosure, and what was the effect for those individuals?
Encore une fois.
Well, once again, when you decide to disclose wrongdoing, there may be cases where you try to stay anonymous, but around you there are people working, there are people in the chain of command, but people start trying to figure out who disclosed the wrongdoing. And sometimes when you start looking, you end up thinking wrongly that it's a specific individual. So there may be cases where there are reprisals against individuals who weren't even involved in that wrongdoing. That's what happens when there's a witch hunt. So that raises this issue of protecting all those people, including those people who were wrongly identified as the whistleblowers. So there are two aspects to this problem. The first is you have to make sure that the people who blow the whistle are able to trust the system. And secondly, you have to make sure that no one be a victim of reprisals, whether they're actually the whistleblower or not. Reprisals should not happen, period.
Chair.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Housefather for 5, please.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Jean-Denis, for coming here today. I'd like to congratulate you on your work. You're an MP who's always working very hard, and I'm so pleased to see you here today. I just want to continue along Greg's line of questioning. I'm a little concerned about removing reasonable grounds and good faith from the Act. We were talking about how we could find a way forward on this. Would you agree, both of you, would you agree that there should be there should be a reasonable chance of a person who comes forward being believed? Something may be true, yes, but perhaps there's a way of wording good faith differently, using a different word. Well, yes, you're right. You know, we need to protect whistleblowers. And we don't want to protect libel, for example. We don't want just to protect anyone. But we were a little uncomfortable with the words good faith being used, because then you are coming to a conclusion about the intentions or intent of a person. But, you know, if the person believes that they are reasonably right in what they've seen, well, perhaps that would actually keep the intent. So we wouldn't necessarily need to draw conclusions about their intent if we were to use different wording. Thank you. I have another question. There's also a referral to chief executives in the bill. And perhaps some people think that that has to do with money. Could you explain exactly what this involves? Well, there was some ambiguity, yes. You know, the clerks of the House did an analysis of this, and they said that a royal recommendation would be required because money would be involved. And this comes from two parts. So let me take a few seconds without wanting to avoid your question. We wanted to expand the whistleblowers to contractors. And we wanted support to be able to be offered. And because of this, because it might imply money, well, would maybe have needed royal recommendation. So there may be amendments that will come forward. When we say support, what we mean is this. When someone comes forward with a complaint, we want to make sure that they are properly accompanied by the system, so not costly in case of new appropriations. So we will bring forward a more specific amendment to that. So you will specify then that it won't be a financial support. Yes. So let's talk about contractors for a moment, seeing as you referred to that. There's a certain percentage of contracts that fall under provincial jurisdiction. Would you not say there's a jurisdictional problem then if contractors are being treated the same as employees? Well, yes, that is an aspect of the bill that was pointed out to us. And we feel that the whistleblowing regime has to be strengthened and broadened, but it has to apply to public servants. There are other words like abuse of authority. How would you define that? Could you just define that for us or talk to us about what it is? Well, we're broadening the definition of wrongdoing. So political interference would be included, for example. Now, it might be perceived as being new, but it's in other laws. It's in American legislation. It was raised by the Government Accountability Project. Basically, any action that is against a government interest. The words used in the States is improper intervention. Now, abuse of power or authority refers to a manager. Should we define it in the bill? After consultation with legal experts, what we've realized is that it may be vague, but it's actually already well defined in a Public Administration Act, and it's already used in labor, in the labor sector. So this is a legally accepted term, which is defined in jurisprudence on labor rights. We're comfortable. Do you know, many things have happened since I tabled the bill. And it is going to be necessary to include foreign interference, for example. You know, if a public...
Spinola for 2.5, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur Garon, j'ai 2 minutes et demie.
Thank you, Mr. Garon. I have 2.5 minutes. But you actually stole my thunder a little when you answered the previous question. What has your bill forgotten that has perhaps happened since you brought it in? What do you think needs to be taken into consideration? Well, I think we need to expand the scope of the bill. We need to define what these categories of wrongdoing are in the Act. And that is why I said there's political interference, abuse of authority. These are rather broad terms, but that are already well defined elsewhere. And as I was about to say to Mr. Housefather, foreign interference, I think, should be in there. This is also a term that has been defined, but is still broad enough. You know, we've seen allegations of Chinese interference, and I think that if public servants or people who work within the public service witness any kind of interference and decide internally that they want to disclose this, they have to be protected. Especially given that if there is already a bad protection regime for whistleblowers, if people don't trust the system, well, they only have one other outlet. That's the media, journalists. And then we're talking about national security risks, and that's also an important consideration. So public servants have to be able to trust the system. Well, speaking of the media, some public servants may be tempted to turn to the media rather than to the current process that we have. Does that have an impact on disclosure and protection? Well, the media do very important work, of course. But as I said at the outset, a scandal is not a management system. There has to be a good whistleblowing regime. These people have to be protected. The procedures have to be improved so that any shortcomings in management that in public administration led to this provide them with protection. So there has to be a mechanism that is improved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Johns for 2.5.
Another benefit of the bill is that it would allow public workers to report wrongdoing to, say, an officer in the portion of the public sector in which they are employed, not just their immediate supervisor. Can you maybe share with us what the value is in that and why it's so important that whistleblowers have the ability to make that choice?
In some cases, the wrongdoing that the public servant is a witness of is in their own unit and may come from their superior. At some points, they can go beyond this person and go higher up, which can be intimidating. But in some cases, whereas this should be done simply to go see the manager of a unit within the same department, and it could simplify the process. and develop a culture of transparency and honest discussion. The more processes are simple, the easier it is to solve these issues before they get out of hand.
Of the act to wrongdoings in the public sector that involve abuse of authority and political interference. With these additions, is the list of potential wrongdoings broad enough? And have you heard from whistleblowers or advocates that any other category should be included?
Comme j'ai mentionné,
As I mentioned earlier, these two added categories may not be enough, time will tell us, but it's a major step ahead. And adding these two categories gives us the possibility of adding more wrongdoings. Foreign interference should be added. But I would like to specify, Mr. John, that the bill sets out a 5-year review mechanism, which isn't the case at this point because the political world evolves, organizational structures evolve, the structure of the government evolves, and it's very important for the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act should be adapted as such. And this is a big step forward that will lead us to the necessary thought process. In 5 years, we can see if further categories should be added. Has the environment evolved? Should we add new categories? And I think this is a very strong mechanism in that regard. Updating this act is seldom a priority.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for joining us. I am pleased to see this bill come to committee. I did have the opportunity to speak to it at second reading. As you are aware, the Federal Accountability Act was brought in back in 2006-07 by a Conservative government following the Liberal sponsorship scandal. And over time, we have obviously seen that the protections which were provided in that act are not adequate. It's always good to review legislation with a view to improving upon it. I believe that probably is what motivated this committee to undertake a study back in 2017 and come forward with a number of recommendations to update whistleblower protections. And I know there were a number of these recommendations put forward. I think there were 15. I'm wondering if you could highlight for the committee and potentially those who are listening in, which recommendations did you use as part of this piece of legislation?
I already answered this question more broadly, and if you allow me this courtesy, I could respond in writing to map all of these recommendations and or how they relate to the bill.
Appreciate that. Neither did I do a side-by-side in regard to the bill and the recommendations. I want to refer to the annual report on the Public Servants Disclosure Act for 2021-2022. And in that report, the Chief Human Resource Officer stated the following, and I'm just going to find it here in the report. That in the 2021-2022 fiscal year, federal government organizations received more inquiries and allegations than in any of the previous 5 years. And most of the allegations concerned a single serious breach of conduct. In parallel, we also saw the highest number of formal investigations launched. While these results may indicate public servants' growing awareness of the Act, we know that more work is needed to strengthen the disclosure system to ensure employees have the confidence to come forward with cases of potential wrongdoing without fear of reprisal. That end quote. Are you or were you at all concerned that the government abstained on the vote to send this bill to committee?
j'ai bien confiance qu'ils voteront.
I trust that they will vote for it at the third reading.
You have a lot more trust than many of us in this room. Do you think that it showed a lack of commitment to protecting whistleblowers, especially considering the lack of action in implementing the recommendations from the OGO report, and that it was something that was included in the TBS mandate letter?
Votre question me donne l'opportunité de lancer un message qui est extrêmement important. C'est que
regardless of the way people voted at the second reading, today we do have the opportunity to move forward, members of Parliament and members of this committee. Looking forward, I feel that the environment is favorable to moving forward with this bill. And I firmly want to ask colleagues to vote for it, and I think it can be done.
To amendments to this bill?
bien sûr, c'est
Of course, that's a prerogative of the committee to study amendments, and we're working on a certain number of amendments. This is a nonpartisan issue, and any type of amendment that would enhance it, improve it, broaden its scope are welcome. That's my intention, and I hope it's the intention of other parliamentarians.
Thank you, Mrs. Block, and we'll go to you to finish up, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the work you've done on this bill. I think it's incredibly important, and your dedication and your ability to really bring people together around this is a credit to you, and thank you. Couple of questions. Could you talk about the rationale for including the Public Sector Integrity Commission to assess or review internal disclosure processes within organizations, and really against what standard would the commissioner assess them?
Ouais.
The purpose is to make sure that complaints are dealt with in the fairest way possible before legal remedies, which often discourage whistleblowers from doing their work. The objective here, as I explained earlier, is for a tribunal or court of second instance where potential remedies could be decided upon. This doesn't prevent, or this would allow whistleblowers to appeal at the federal court afterwards, and it adds the possibility for whistleblowers to benefit from better justice. I may have misunderstood your question. The commissioner has an added mandate to evaluate the work of departments. Was that what your question was about? The commissioner who oversees information does this in the case of applications for access to information. And, for example, does it respect the Official Languages Act? But for whistleblowers, there isn't a neutral third party that oversees the work of the government and makes recommendations to improve this work. And in our view, the commissioner is in the best position to do this.
And that back to the tribunal. So the rationale for requiring a tribunal to accept the commissioner's finding of reprisal. Does this change a reprisal proceeding from an administrative investigation to a quasi-judicial hearing?
Oui, la réponse est oui. La réponse est oui, je m'excuse.
The response is yes. I should be listening to the interpretation, but we believe that with this type of administrative court that you see elsewhere in the public apparatus, that this would facilitate the proceedings and doesn't prevent the possibility of appealing at the federal court afterwards.
I realize, we're coming to the end of this round. Is there anything else that you would like to comment on, or something that just the timeline around the questioning that the thoughts that you want to bring forward.
D'abord, je vous remercie.
First of all, I would like to thank all parliamentarians who studied very thoroughly the bill, which leads to a very interesting conversation. I may have one last very important comment. Becoming a whistleblower isn't something you choose. You become a whistleblower because of the situation. And when a person has the courage to go through the process, and it does take a lot of courage, there are major consequences, even with the best or even with a very strong bill. It does take a change of culture, and it is very difficult to legislate on this. But the Act must be improved to minimize the cost for these persons who profoundly want to serve their employer and the public apparatus. And that's the priority, and therefore I would like to thank you for your questions.
Okay, that'll be very quick and say thank you, because I think the human face is so important, the courage to come forward and really being able to hold a voice in a very difficult circumstance. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. MP Grant, Mr. Roche, thank you very much for being with us today. We will excuse you. Colleagues, if you can just give our clerk a couple seconds so we can set up for their next witnesses. With a bit of luck, we'll be able to do their opening statements, and then we probably will suspend for the vote and then come back to finish the two rounds. Yes, we'll suspend for a second. back. Mr. Fergus, we're back. Welcome, witnesses. Welcome back, Mrs. Ford. It's wonderful to see you again. I appreciate you joining us, and I appreciate everything you've done in the past helping this committee and with whistleblowers. And welcome, Mr. Sabourin. Do you each have 5-minute opening statements? We'll start with you, Mrs. Ford. Go ahead, please, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Pamela Forward, President and Executive Director of Whistleblowing Canada Research Society, and we appreciate very much the opportunity to speak with everybody today. Our heartfelt thanks to MPs who thus far have supported Private Members Bill C-290, an act to amend the Public Service Disclosure Protection Act, and to Bloc Québécois Member of Parliament, Mr. Jean-Denis Garon, member for Mirabel, for bringing it forward. This bill is a long-awaited signal that a sign of humanity, compassion, and respect towards Canada's public servant whistleblowers. It will make significant, much-needed improvements and hopefully provoke many more to the deficient PSDPA. In my time with you, I will highlight some historical facts, why improvement in Canada's whistleblowing regime is needed, and thoughts on what more can be done. So in terms of history, here are some key facts. Both of Canada's major parties have had a hand in the creation of the PSDPA, which was implemented in 2007, and clearly knew before the fact that the bill would not improve anything for whistleblowers, as Justice Gomery warned of this in his report on the sponsorship scandal in 1995. Instead of encouraging and empowering whistleblowers, what it really did was control and suppress them. And more missteps perpetuated the suffering and enabled wrongdoers. First, the 2012 government decision to disobey a statute, an indictable offense, and as they did not conduct the required independent review of the PSDPA after 5 years. And next, the new government leader's decision to ignore the OGO Committee's 2017 unanimous report of its review of the PSDPA, recommending more than 20 amendments, if I remember correctly. So why improvements are needed then? Studies and whistleblower cases confirm that truth and truth tellers in Canada are imperiled by this uncompromising unwillingness, at least up to now, to improve, to provide true protection and to stop reprisals. This peril includes major catastrophes, both to individuals and society at large, up to and including death. And when truth dies, harm and corruption grows. The studies and findings are listed in my submission. They confirm our flawed legislation and dysfunctional cultures. A key finding also is that legislation alone will not protect whistleblowers. The overriding factor for success is culture. If laws are introduced into an unwelcoming, resistant culture, they will not be properly upheld. So a few whistleblower cases, and this is an old one. It has current consequences. 30 years ago in the 1990s, national security whistleblowers from then External Affairs, the RCMP and CSIS were suppressed, ostracized, careers and health destroyed for just doing their jobs. They reported on corruption in the Canadian High Commission in Hong Kong that allowed Chinese triads, criminals, to flow into Canada and bring along with them drug and human trafficking, money laundering, inflated house prices, etc. The consequences have persisted until today and have grown to include interference in Canada's elections by the CCP. So a current case waiting to be told. This case concerns the Canadian Border Services Agency and an officer who simply did his job by refusing to comply with illegal and potentially criminal orders from his superiors. And you're going to hear from him in person. Breathtaking and frightening is the litany of failures of all the authorities he contacted who should have helped, could have helped, but didn't, which sadly included MPs from most parties, a living testimony to the disintegration of our democratic institutions in real time. Something else to consider, well, I'm going to leave this. I hope it'll come up because of time. So what is needed then is Bill C-290. It contains 8 internationally recognized best practices. There are 20 in all. A few more are needed to give a whistleblower a reasonable chance to prevail. We urge you to work collaboratively to include as many as possible in the bill. This is not a partisan issue. Our democracy is under stress, and we need, and you need, whistleblowers to come forward to help defend it. So the problems plaguing the Colonel regime are, I'm just going to list them, and I have listed solutions in a table.
I have to ask you to be very
Flawed
brief,
legislation, implementation failure, uncommitted and ineffective leadership, political and administrative cultures that stress information control, and lack of constructive scrutiny by Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ford. Mr. Sabourin, please, for 5 minutes.
Mesdames et messieurs.
Thank you very much for having me today. I'd like to thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Garand and Ms. Vignola. My name is Luc Sabourin. I'm 55 years old. I'm a father of 2 young children, a 16-year-old girl and a 12-year-old boy. I am an internal federal whistleblower. I was the main operator for quality control of critical and specific information entries into a federal database that contributed in part to national and international security. I have held the highest restricted security clearance in the exercise of my duties in operational environments for the Canadian government, and that for 26 years of service without incident in my career record. My career began on August 13, 1990, and ended abruptly and tragically on February 16, 2016. During the period of March 2009 to February 2016, I witnessed several instances of wrongdoing and criminal acts in my workplace. On February 16, 2016, I received a supposed administrative dismissal, and this administrative procedure was the final phase on the part of my employer after 8 years of psychological, physical, and administrative harassment. This disguised dismissal was a major retaliatory step on the part of the employer for 2 reasons. An external investigation, but an extremely limited one and under administrative control, revealed and demonstrated that the employer was guilty of harassment against me. Second, I used the internal disclosure process, and I religiously followed the employer's internal guidelines and protocols on disclosure of wrongdoing and criminal acts in the federal workplace. A major campaign of retaliation against me was initiated by management and fellow employees with the sole purpose of harming and destroying me in order to catch me in the act and justify a dismissal. This was for 8 years. I was the victim of extremely excessive psychological, physical, administrative harassment in the workplace, as well as a smear campaign, abusive management, and unjustified threats on behalf of colleagues and management staff to the point of my psychological collapse. In 2015, I had reached the point of psychological breakdown, and I made an unsuccessful suicide attempt. Today, life is giving me a new chance that allows me to speak on behalf of those who are no longer with us, some of my colleagues, and those who are present. No one should have to experience what whistleblowers are subjected to at the hand of the employer. I asked for help from the president of my workplace, from my federal Liberal MP, as well as the Minister of Public Safety, the Minister of Justice, and I also filed a complaint with the RCMP with no success to date. Today, I am in permanent medical retirement. I am a physically, mentally, and financially destroyed person. My personal life and my professional career has been destroyed, and the future is uncertain for me and my family. I can assure you with great certainty that the Government of Canada and the people of Canada had an experienced public servant with integrity and transparency in representing their interests. And it is for these reasons that the employer actually terminated my career as a federal public servant. It is imperative for all of our sakes to amend the current law by adopting C-290 for federal whistleblowers in order to protect them and save the lives of whistleblowing public servants in the interest of transparency and justice. Democracy and public safety must be protected from potentially destructive and illegal situations within the federal public sector. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. We'll start for 6 minutes with Mrs. Cusi.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for coming today. Mr. Sabourin, I am shocked to hear your story and saddened. Thank you for sharing your story with us. I'm glad I'm here today because I hope that today is the beginning of a change. And as I've already said, there was a report in 2017, as you're aware, but unfortunately we haven't seen any changes under the current government. So at least this bill today is a beginning. And I hope that it's only a beginning because I don't want people to have to experience what you've experienced. No one should experience what you experienced. Thank you very much. Ms. Forward.
Did you want to finish any of your statement that you had the recommendations, you read them? Was there anything else you wanted to add? I wanted to provide you with that time to add.
Well, no, I just would like to have the opportunity at some stage to
This could be
talk
that
about
stage.
the proposed solutions for the problems that I itemized.
Please go ahead.
All right. So the first one was
Pardon me,
flawed
are these the Braun amendments that
Sorry?
are these the Braun amendments that we discussed in our meeting?
No.
Okay, all right. And then please continue with what you planned on your solutions. Go ahead.
Just just briefly in terms of flawed legislation, I would like to suggest that everybody here knows what effective legislation looks like. You've got access to international experts. You've got the work of the 2017 committee. So it just remains for you to do it, and to do what needs to be done. And there's no rational reason, from my perspective, why Canadians should not have all 20 best practices in the law. Why should we just stick with 8 that are there now and a few more, the 3 or 4 more that, are really imperative if we want to be able to hold our heads up, at least be at some kind of a level status with other countries, our peer countries, our democracies around the world. So that is what I have to say there. Please don't stop. As many as possible best practices are needed. In terms of implementation failure. So we need, as has been mentioned here today, to provide adequate internal and external disclosure mechanisms which provide the necessary functions for success. That includes advisory for internally and, if they decide to go to the commissioner, the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner. That includes awareness training, awareness raising training, legal support, psychological support, and all of those things that have been mentioned. The investigation of wrongdoing and reprisals, that should be included internally as well. And as been mentioned, adjudicative, supportive action, protection of the disclosure, and prevention of harm. That should all be part and parcel of what an internal disclosure mechanism looks like. It doesn't exist right now. It means that people need to learn how to actively listen. They need to become aware of the invisible forces driving reprisals, the psychological and unconscious forces such as conformity in groups and obedience to authority, and how we behave when we perceive threats. Our automatic response that we're often not aware of is to destroy the threat. It's a holdover from our days as cavemen, trying to survive. So we fight. Then in terms of uncommitted and ineffective leadership, leaders need to lead the change, and that's been the problem. They need to be a visible part of the behavior change communication plan. That's the next step. It's not just legislation. That is essential to culture change. There should be no gap between what a leader says and a leader does. And when there have been huge gaps, right? The leaders say one thing, we have this wonderful law, but when it comes to ensuring that all the things that the law says should be done to ensure that we have a workable mechanism and that the law is being translated in the public service, we didn't follow up. And those things did not take place. There was no training and no awareness raising, no leadership, really. And if there is a gap, what that signals is insincerity, and trust will be lost again, leading to failure. Political and administrative cultures that stress control over information.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Ford, but that is our time, and
Okay.
we've got to try and get a couple more folks
All
before
right.
we suspend for the vote.
Just a few more points, and thank you very much.
Well, there'll be a lot of time second go around. Mr. Fergus?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I also would like to thank our two witnesses today. And I would like also to salute the courage of Mr. Sabourin for coming before the committee to testify. This was a very painful affair, and I just want to congratulate you on your courage for coming today.
I will, before I get into my questions, perhaps I'll leave you the opportunity to just finish off your answer to Mrs. Kuzi, if you don't mind continuing just to finish off that part, and then I'll get to your question.
It's, very short. So in terms of political and administrative cultures, my suggestion is that what is needed is to develop open, listening, and reflective cultures to replace defensive, controlling ones if public trust is to be maintained. We need to shift from command and control public administration to listening and learning approaches. We need to admit errors, accept responsibility, correct them, and learn. There are actually organizations, there's a Center for Public Impact that's working with governments around the world to implement exactly this change, which, I really would highly recommend you ask somebody from there to come and present to you. It's amazing the work that they're doing. And then the last point, lack of constructive scrutiny by Parliament. I recommend that there be an ongoing parliamentary committee with oversight functions which would interact with NGOs and whistleblowers to ensure system feedback and ongoing maintenance. I'm taking part now in an international movement. There's actually a committee being led by the UK, it's amazing the work that they're doing. They're passing now a new law. It's a private member's bill that's just whooshing its way through Parliament, but there's an all-party parliamentary group that is working intimately with civil society whistleblower support groups. They're actually, the Whistleblowers UK is providing the secretariat to the all-party parliamentary group, and they've passed an amazing, they're in the process of passing a law to establish the whistleblower, the Office of the Whistleblower, which has teeth and can issue sanctions against wrongdoers.
My next question to you, Mrs. Forward, is regarding an international comparison. We know we've heard that there are different bodies which would rate Canada poorly, but it's one of those things where you can have a great legal framework and you have no follow-up at all in practicality. So I'm not certain about that international comparison. But according to you, which country has the best example and the best balance between a legislative framework and a culture that actually respects that legislative framework? What's the standard that we should look to?
I don't know that there's any country that's best. So the United States is known as pretty much the inventor of whistleblowing, I guess. They've had whistleblowing since the first act in the 1700s when, contractors were cheating the government. I don't know, there was a war going on or something, I don't remember. But and they've had whistleblowing legislation since 1979 and, various iterations and improvements. But what happens is they still have culture problems. The government actually, the difference I think is the government takes whistleblowing seriously. They think it's important that, to have proper legislation. But in terms of culture, what seems to have happened is that whenever they pass an amendment to block, some kind of a gap and improve things, people in the organizations work very hard to try and find ways around it, even if that means reclassifying jobs so that, they're now security sensitive, and then they lay criminal charges against whistleblowers. So there are culture problems wherever you go.
Mrs. Forward and Mr. Sabourin.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Ms. Vinola, please, for a second.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Forward, thank you for coming today. Mr. Sabourin, thank you. Mr. Sabourin, my questions will be for you, but if you feel that my questions are indiscreet or too difficult to answer, please feel comfortable in telling me so. I can take it. In your opening remarks, you referred to reprisals that you experienced. Could you describe a few of those to us so that it is crystal clear to the public what can happen? You referred to a suicide attempt. I am really pleased to see that you're here today with us. But that was one of the ultimate consequences of what you experienced. What was happening before? After having reported to management what I'd seen, I started being set aside. Either I didn't have work, I wasn't given work, or the work that I was given didn't reflect my skills. Sometimes work was taken away from me that I did have skills for. Sometimes there would be a few days where I didn't have any work, and then all of a sudden I'd get a pile of work at the end of the day on Friday, equivalent to a week's worth of work, that there was no way I could get done by the end of the day. And what worried me was this was operational work. It was important work that our agents needed to have at the border so that they could work. And when they saw that they weren't able to find fault with me, then my work started being sabotaged. And when that didn't work, my office was vandalized. I've provided photos, to the point where it took me a few days to find my things. After there was an attempt to open investigations into me. For example, I helped a colleague. He was new. And he didn't know the difference between a travel number and a PIN number or TIN number. I was accused of accessing information I wasn't authorized to access. I went through this process, through a process with the management, and the head of security actually ended up confirmed that I had done my work. At one point, I was sick off and on, and we didn't know why I was getting sick. Well, one morning they found Purell in my coffee, and that was a triggering event. So if I understood what you were saying, the bullying went as far as an attempt to poison me, yes. I asked that cameras be put in my office, and that request was refused. So upper management said, if the person who was doing that is found guilty, well, then we would have to open up all those files in the federal court, and that could embarrass the department. So the embarrassment of the department was worth more than your life. That's the message you were being given. Yes. Yes. It went even further. I had to testify for the Canada Border Services Agency. On organized crime, and a few weeks before I was threatened, someone had disclosed my personal address. There were threats against me and my children. I needed security for my children in school. So if I've understood you correctly, the bullying and the intimidation didn't only include an attempt to poison you, but your personal address and your personal details were provided to organized crime? Well, no. Someone gave my information, my personal address. And there are individuals who came to my home, surrounded me, they threatened my children, and the only way that information could have been disclosed would have been from my office. Because when you testify, you give your address. Well, what you're saying appear to me to be criminal acts. Did you go to the RCMP or the QPP? I went to the RCMP with all the information that I had, everything I had said, all the photos. And they said that didn't fall under the jurisdiction of their unit, and that wasn't transferred anywhere else. Did they give you any reason for that? The letter simply said that it didn't fall under the jurisdiction of their unit. If you were to start over again, would you have blown the whistle? Yes, but perhaps in another way. I would put everything in an envelope and I would send it to the media. That's all I would do. Because the system let me down. It abandoned me. And the managers that I contacted and the directors in place at the time told me that it was more important for me to focus on my career and to think about my family and my pension than to think about the legal repercussions of allegations that I would be making against fellow members and members of management.
Mr. Johns for 6, and then we'll suspend and vote and come back.
Well, thank you both for being here, for your passion to fix this. I can't say enough about it. Thank you, Ms. Forward. I also am going to go to you, Mr. Sabourin, and just again share the absolute gratitude for your courage to be here today and the strength that you have and resolve for justice for future workers and current workers as well, so that they may feel safe and be able to come forward in the future. You know, many of the accountability experts and whistleblower advocates, they've voiced concerns that the fact that the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner has declined to investigate some pretty major high-stakes cases, such as, you know, issues with Phoenix, issues that you've seen, you know, in your work. Do you believe that the commissioner, who's typically been a government public servant, represents a conflict of interest, someone that's been involved like that?
Yes, sir, I do. I reached out to Commissioner of Integrity myself. I provided to him 2 years of material, and within a very short time frame, he came back and excluded a certain amount of information. It was brought to my attention by a director at my unit that the Integrity Commissioner and the person that I was pointing out in my complaints had previously worked together and known each other. So I requested from the Integrity Commissioner a formal notice asking him to explain to me if he had any conflict of interest with the people I pointed out in my complaint, and he refused.
Do you have any suggestions, like having maybe an independent person be appointed moving forward?
Yes, sir. My recommendation to the members of Parliament before was that any type of situation like mine involving officers in operational environment where the risk to the Canadian government and the people that are working in the field should be turned over to an independent person, somebody that has no ties to nobody. And a second person should be verifying the information and the validity of the information and the decision that is made. So that's the important transparency that we can have. I hope I make sense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Again, I really admire your strength in being here today, and I want to thank you for that. I'm going to give you some time to talk about, what do you believe are the in terms of the failures, and what are the foundational aspects of strong whistleblower protections that need to be in this bill, that might not be in the bill yet, that we could look at to strengthen the bill, and work with our friend and colleague as well.
I think that we all have to gain by working all together, every one of you, regardless of the party you represent. We all represent you, the public servant. And when the problem that we face is people in high position of authority that are engaged in wrongdoing or criminal activity, we have nobody to turn to. And the mechanism in place to report it turns over the information that we give and the evidence that we have to the people that are the ones that we are reporting on. This cannot continue. We cannot continue that way because it's not conducive. It's impossible to continue that way. We need to have an independent party that will take the information and protect us and protect everybody else and give the opportunity to any law enforcement agency to investigate discreetly to see the magnitude of the problem that we have or whatever damage that was done. It's very important that this concept is done. Otherwise, the system keeps failing us.
Thank you for your service too to Canada.
Thank you, sir.
And Ms. Ford, do you want to add to that question that I just asked?
I'm sorry.
I just give you some time in terms of, what's missing in the bill that could be improved to help improve the bill.
Well, look, all I can say is we have the 8 best practices here. I think in order to give whistleblowers a reliable chance to prevail, we absolutely need the burden of proof, or the reverse onus requirement should be there, where a manager must prove the action taken was not a reprisal rather than the employee prove that it was. We need to also consider the question of financial losses to someone who is penalized for simply upholding the law and doing his job. At least have legal support in the system. That should be part of the system. And the third thing that I think is really important is that the amended PSDPA should ban NDAs and should supersede such regulations that may occur in other laws, like NDAs that say that you can't expose or go public if somebody is doing something wrong.
I'm going to interrupt here. You just have about 10 seconds, Mr. John. So we're going to suspend, we'll run and vote, and then we'll come back. back. We appreciate witnesses you putting up with us doing our democratic duty. We're into our final round. We're going to start 5 minutes with Mrs. Block.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to start off by echoing the comments of my colleague, MP Kusi. I also want to recognize and speak to the courage, I think that's been alluded to here, and the resolve that it has taken, I believe, for you to speak out and speak publicly. I won't speak for all of us, but I would say that it is very difficult to understand how a professional public service would allow this culture to exist, and even more difficult to understand and to hear is the extent of the intimidation that you were subjected to, and the impact that had on your mental, physical, and well-being. I want to thank you for coming forward, Mr. Sabourin, and sharing your story with us. I also want to thank Mr. Guérin one more time for introducing Bill C-290. I think the only thing worse than doing nothing is believing that you are doing something when you in fact are not. And so reviewing this piece of legislation, acting on it, I think is something that we are very committed to on this side of the House, of the room. And so I don't really have any more questions. I would just perhaps turn the floor back to either of you to make any final comments that you would like to make to this committee today.
Just my story. It's the story of every public servant that is loyal to this government and are facing this dilemma. So it's not just me. That's something that needs to be understood. I'm here on behalf of everybody that probably didn't have the strength or the chance that I have to be here today. So it's very important to make this distinction.
Well, I would just like to underline what Mr. Sabourin has said. Our organization was set up to advance education on the whistleblowing phenomena through research and sharing that information publicly. We did not announce in any way that we provided services to whistleblowers, but we end up providing support for whistleblowers because they call us, because there's nowhere else for them to go. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard similar to Luke's. And I'd just like to share briefly, we just established a few months ago a support group for whistleblowers, and we have a professional facilitator managing the group. Actually, she's a former legislator from Manitoba who's facilitating the group. 3 of them had to leave the group. They could not even participate in the group. They are so mentally harmed, PTSD. They see threats and suspicion everywhere. They suspected me because when they found out that I was a former public servant, I was also a former, I worked in a minister's office, actually. And so I became suspect immediately. So I guess what we need to understand is that there is new information. It actually is old information, but it's becoming more publicly, aware and available that this kind of behavior, this bullying and harassment, causes actual brain damage that can be seen on brain scan, which changes the landscape actually for employers. They now may become more legally liable if you can go in hand with a brain scan, in the face of a history of harassment and bullying and, being fired from the public service or from any organization. And when we're talking about the public servants, it's a small minority of Canadian employees who are putting up with this kind of work. We hear from municipal, provincial people as well. And we've forgotten about the federally incorporated private sector that has no protection.
Thank you. Mr. Baines for 5, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. And I will echo the statements of everybody else on thanking Mr. Sabaran for showing the courage to revisit ultimately your painful lived experience, and also to our colleague Monsieur Garon for bringing this forward again. I think Mr. Sabaran talked a little bit about this. Like the bill includes, quote, making failures to provide support, end quote, to a public servant, making a reprisal a part of the act. And would this change violating the confidentiality of the process, as additional people would need to know the identity of the disclosure? So I think you mentioned that it ultimately goes to people who know the people that know the people. So, if we look at my question to Madam Forward there, C-290 also includes a new category of wrongdoing, quote, abuse of authority, but it has no definition within the bill. So how can the committee solve the problem of how to define that?
Well, I think anything that smacks of wrongness is abuse of authority. People know instinctively when authority is being abused, like bullying, harassment. That's abuse of authority. That's part of abusing authority, is abusing your power, not, exercising your power justly, fairly, and actually not having a lot of it probably could be not even having the skills to do so. Part of being, a good manager, a good employer, is listening. In order to be able to develop speak up cultures, you first need to have managers who know how to listen up. Listen up. Then, people, they feel heard, right? If they can go to their manager and their manager doesn't get excited when they perhaps make a suggestion that, you've noticed something that could be done better, instead of, taking it as a personal insult that you haven't done your job as a manager, which is often one of the things that sparks reprisals. They could just learn the skills of active listening. That encourages people to come forward. That's one of the problems, really, is just not having skills.
Can you expand on you said this has been going on for a long time. Maybe Mr. Sabaran can also add, the culture, the culture of this for continuing on in various departments. And we've seen it in other areas as well. So whether it's RCMP, whether it's other
absolutely
administrative areas, just speak to the culture and what kinds of things that you think. I know you've talked about active listening, but expand on that if you could, please.
Thank you for the question. So I guess we're talking about an internal environment. There are 3 things that impact an internal environment. One is structure, one is leadership, the other is culture. So structure, particularly when you have strict vertical hierarchies, they're very susceptible to developing dysfunctional cultures, mainly because of problems with communication, right? And that's what, the bill is trying to get around. And particularly if the wrongdoing is top down, there's just no options for a whistleblower, as Mr. Savarin has mentioned. So the other question is leadership. So leaders have a huge impact on cultures in organizations. And it's all leaders say, oh, yeah, we're very open and, we want to hear what you have to say, come to us, an open door, no problem. But
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you again. We're past our 5 minutes
Oh,
for Mr.
sorry.
Baines.
Okay.
We're going to hand things over to Mrs. Vinola now, please.
Okay.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Sabourin. Before getting to the heart of my question, I have something else to ask you. Were you afraid to come here? Were you afraid of reprisals? Yes. I received threats that if I spoke to Parliament or to the media, I would see my pension taken away. From 2016 to 2022, it was kept back. And it's a way of muzzling me so that I don't speak to people, so that I don't use ways to expose what happened. Are you receiving any benefit, any sort of advantages from being here? Not at all, no. Earlier on, you said you worked with the Passport Office. No, I worked with integrity of documents. What would have been the consequences to national security of Canada, whether that's our reputation here or abroad, if you hadn't exposed wrongdoing? And in the end, do you feel that you were forced to disclose? I felt I had a legal and moral obligation to disclose what was happening that was a risk to Canada in terms of losing its reputation with allies. I could not close my eyes to this. What was happening was very serious. It was criminal activity, I would say. And when I reported it to management, immediately after, life was very difficult. If our allies had discovered what was happening, we could have lost our credibility. It could have actually broken well-established relationships that we have with other countries. Are you able to give us details to us, details that would have led to allies losing their trust in us? Do I have parliamentary immunity? You have complete immunity. There were people in positions of authority who gave us orders to destroy passports and to indicate in our data banks that they had been returned, actually. I intervened. I told management that it was illegal to do this and that we couldn't create false documents in our data banks that could be eventually used in federal court. I was told they would stop doing this. There was a closed-door meeting where passport destruction continued, and yet it was filed that, or it was written that passports were returned. And what cost me my career was reporting this. How do you explain that to this date, no real change has been made to protect whistleblowers? How do you explain the fact that changes have not taken place to do this and that none of the recommendations coming from this committee have been implemented over the past 6 years? I don't want to point the finger at anyone, but changing legislation to protect us, I think, makes some people, some well-established people, very afraid. There's an established culture. The only people who can make these changes are you, the people sitting around the table at this committee. You're the only ones who can do this. Otherwise, that culture is going to remain. There is no way to do this unless you have the opportunity to make this change.
We'll finish with Mr. Johns for 2.5, please.
Can you maybe speak about, and ask Mr. Garand this, there's a benefit of the bill that would allow public servants to report wrongdoing to an officer in the portion of the public sector in which they are employed, not just their immediate supervisor. Would that have helped you, Mr. Soberan, to be able to, to have that in place in this bill? So I guess basically, I guess maybe you could speak about the potential, of more than one method of recourse and resolution also to be pursued.
If I understand the question perfectly, as you're saying, if someone had opportunity to approach a supervisor
your own, if you could go beyond your own immediate supervisor.
Okay.
To
I went to every level of chain of command to explain that situation, and the system failed me. Which brings the fact that what I state is that we need to have an independent area to report, so that, like I said earlier, a proper investigation could be done without anybody knowing what's going on. Even the person that we report could still establish if there's any merit to what we bring forward without causing discomfort to anybody. But when we report to our supervisor or anybody else in the chain of command, especially if it involves the people in the chain of command, well, there's not much we can do. There's no way this information or any type of administrative action will be initiated. So I hope I understand. I clarified the question.
Perfect. Yeah. Ms. Forward, one of the critical improvements that we believe needs to be made to the Act is expanding whistleblower protections to contractors who do public service work. Now we're seeing all this outsourcing, all these contractors coming in. Can you speak about why it's important and maybe you've seen, contractors who witness wrongdoing and want to report it, and those who do report it? Can you speak about the importance of that?
Yeah, and just a brief answer, please.
Yeah, I haven't heard a lot. I've heard about a couple of, big cases. I think it's obvious that anybody who has witnessed wrongdoing on the part of any government entity or any entity whatsoever should be protected. And many countries protect all of their citizens. That's part of their legislation. Anybody, any citizen without qualification is protected who reports wrongdoing to authorities who can do something about it. No reason Canada should be different.
Thank you very much, colleagues. That is our time. I just want to ask one brief question, Mr. Soberan. Could you explain why they're destroying those passports? Just walk me through.
I have no valuable explanation for you for why they're doing it. The explanation they provided to me, they basically said that they were not had no obligation to tell me because I was a junior officer. But I explained to them that it was a criminal offense what they were doing. And with my experience of the 12 years I was in that unit, I cannot explain to you why they were doing it. The explanation they provide to me made no sense. I challenged them on it, and I verified their doings, and it was not valid.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us today. Ms. Ford, thank you as well. It's wonderful to see you. You mentioned the U.S. It was actually the Revolutionary War with their Navy, and the U.S. is blessed with a senator from Iowa, Senator Chuck Grassley, who's called the patron saint of whistleblowers. I'm hoping that through what we've started today and started earlier, perhaps we can have 12 further patron saints in Canada for whistleblowers. So thank you sincerely for your time today, both of you. Colleagues, if there's nothing else, we are adjourned. Thank you.